Margaret Henderson walked slowly through the front doors of the community center. Her gray hair was tied back in a neat bun. She wore her best blue dress, the one she saved for special occasions. In her hands, she carried an old brown folder, filled with sheet music. The papers inside were yellow with age, but she had kept them safe for many years. The community center was busy that Tuesday morning. People were moving chairs and tables around. Others were hanging decorations from the ceiling. Everyone was getting ready for the big charity event that would happen that evening. Margaret had heard about it at the grocery store. The lady behind her in line had talked about how they needed help with the event. Margaret stopped near the entrance and watched the people work. She was not sure who to talk to. A young woman with blonde hair and a clipboard seemed to be telling everyone what to do. Margaret took a deep breath and walked toward her. The young woman was talking fast on her phone. She had on a bright red shirt and black pants. Her name tag said, Linda, Event Coordinator. Margaret waited patiently while Linda finished her call. When Linda hung up, she looked at Margaret with a quick smile. "Hi there," Linda said. She looked down at her clipboard and then back at Margaret. "Are you here to help with something? We have lots of simple jobs available." Margaret held her folder a little tighter. "I heard you might need a piano player for tonight. I would like to help." Linda looked up from her clipboard. Her eyes moved from Margaret's gray hair to her wrinkled hands. She noticed how Margaret walked a bit slowly and how she held on to things for support. Linda's smile became different. It was the kind of smile adults use when they talk to small children. "Oh, that's so sweet of you to offer," Linda said. Her voice sounded like she was talking to someone who did not understand. "But playing piano for an event like this is really hard work. We need someone who can play for 3 hours straight. Someone with a lot of energy." Margaret felt her cheeks get warm. "I have been playing piano for a long time. I think I could do it." Linda shook her head gently. "I'm sure you play beautifully at home, but this is different. We're expecting over 200 people tonight. The piano music has to be perfect. We can't have any mistakes." She looked around the room and pointed to a table near the door. "But we really need help with the coat check. That would be perfect for you. You could sit down most of the time." Margaret looked where Linda was pointing. An older man was already setting up the coat check area. He looked tired and moved very slowly. Margaret realized that Linda saw her the same way. Just another old person who could not do real work anymore. "I understand," Margaret said quietly. She did not want to argue. She had learned that arguing with people like Linda never worked. Linda patted Margaret's arm. "Thank you so much for understanding. The coat check is really important too. People need someone friendly to help them." She was already looking past Margaret to other volunteers who were carrying boxes. Margaret walked over to the coat check table. The man there introduced himself as Frank. He had kind eyes but looked very tired. "Never worked one of these fancy events before," he said. "Hope I don't mess it up." Margaret sat down in one of the chairs behind the table. From where she sat, she could see the whole room. Workers were setting up a small stage at the far end. They were putting microphones and speakers in place. She watched them carefully move an old upright piano onto the stage. The piano was dark brown wood with some scratches on the sides. It was not the best piano she had ever seen, but it looked like it could make beautiful music. Margaret's fingers moved slightly as she imagined playing it. She had not played for other people in such a long time. "That's a nice piano," Frank said. He had noticed Margaret looking at it. "My wife used to play. Not very well, but she enjoyed it. Do you play?" Margaret nodded. "A little bit." More volunteers came into the room. Most of them were younger people. They moved quickly and talked loudly. Linda was still walking around with her clipboard, giving orders to everyone. She told people where to put tables and how to arrange the chairs. She seemed to know exactly what she wanted. A young man with dark hair came over to Linda. Margaret could hear him talking even though she was sitting far away. "Did you find someone to play piano tonight?" he asked. Linda looked worried, for the first time that morning. "I'm still working on it. The person I hired last week just canceled. She got a better-paying job at a wedding." Linda looked around the room. "I need to find someone fast. This event has to be perfect." The young man nodded. "What kind of music do you need?" "Nothing too fancy," Linda said. "Just background music while people eat dinner. Maybe some popular songs that everyone knows, something light and cheerful." Margaret listened to their conversation. She knew hundreds of popular songs. She had played at dinner parties and small events many times when she was younger. But Linda had already decided she was too old. As the morning went on, more people arrived to help. Margaret watched them hang lights and set up tables with white tablecloths. The room was starting to look very nice. Someone brought in flowers and put them on each table. The smell of roses filled the air. Linda made several phone calls trying to find a piano player. Margaret could tell from Linda's voice that she was getting more worried. Each call ended with disappointment. Margaret wanted to offer her help again, but she knew Linda would just say no. Around lunchtime, Linda gathered all the volunteers together. She stood on the stage next to the piano and spoke through a microphone. "Thank you all for your hard work today. Tonight is going to be wonderful. We're raising money for the Children's Hospital, so every detail matters." She went on to explain what would happen that evening. First, people would arrive and have drinks. Then they would eat dinner while listening to piano music. After dinner, there would be speeches and an auction. "Everything has to go smoothly," Linda said. "We want people to enjoy themselves, so they will donate money." Margaret looked at the piano again. She could see some of the keys from where she sat. Her fingers still remembered how to find the right notes. She had been playing for over 60 years. Music was still a big part of her life, even if no one knew it anymore. But Linda had made her decision. Margaret was just an old lady who should stick to simple jobs like checking coats. Margaret opened her folder and looked at her sheet music. Maybe it was time to accept that her performing days were really over. Margaret sat quietly at the coat check table as the afternoon went by. People came and went, getting ready for the evening event. She helped Frank organize the hangars and tried to smile when volunteers walked past. But her mind was somewhere else. She was thinking about a time long ago when things were very different. It was 1968 when Margaret first stepped onto a big concert stage. Back then, her name was Margaret Steinberg. She was only 25 years old with long dark hair and bright eyes. She wore a beautiful black dress that sparkled under the stage lights. The concert hall in Vienna was full of people who had come just to hear her play. Margaret remembered walking across that stage to the grand piano. Her heart was beating fast, but her hands were steady. She had practiced for months to get ready for that night. When she sat down at the piano bench and put her fingers on the keys, everything else disappeared. There was only her and the music. The audience was completely quiet as she played Chopin's Piano Concerto No. 1. Every note was perfect. Her fingers moved so fast they looked like they were dancing across the keys. The music filled the huge hall and touched every person sitting there. When she finished, the audience jumped to their feet and clapped for 5 full minutes. That was just the beginning. Over the next few years, Margaret played with orchestras in London, Paris, and New York. Music critics wrote wonderful things about her in newspapers. They called her a rising star and a pianist with extraordinary talent. She had recordings of her music that people could buy in stores. Her picture was on the covers of classical music magazines. Margaret smiled a little as she remembered those days. She had traveled all over Europe and America. She stayed in fancy hotels and ate dinner with famous musicians. Everyone wanted to hear her play. She had felt so alive on those stages, sharing her love of music with thousands of people. But life had other plans for her. In 1972, she met Robert Henderson at a small concert in Chicago. He was a kind man who worked as an engineer. He had come to the concert with his sister, who loved classical music. Robert knew nothing about pianos or concerts, but he fell in love with Margaret the moment he saw her. They talked after the concert was over. Robert was different from the musicians and music people Margaret usually met. He was quiet and thoughtful. He asked her questions about her life, not just her music. He wanted to know what made her happy besides playing piano. Margaret had been traveling and performing for 6 years by then. She was getting tired of living out of suitcases and staying in hotels. She missed having a real home and close friends. When Robert asked her to marry him, she said yes. They got married in 1973 in a small church in Robert's hometown. Margaret wore a simple white dress instead of the fancy gowns she wore for concerts. Only family and close friends were there. It was very different from the big concert halls she was used to, but it felt right. Robert's job took them to small towns in the Midwest. Margaret stopped giving big concerts, but she never stopped playing piano. She taught piano lessons to local children in their living room. She played at church services on Sundays. Sometimes she performed at school events or community gatherings. The Haseo people in these small towns did not know about her famous past. To them, she was just Mrs. Henderson, the nice lady who taught piano and helped out at church. Margaret did not mind. She found joy in teaching young children how to read music and watching them learn their first songs. Years went by quickly. Margaret and Robert were happy together. They never had children of their own, but Margaret felt like a mother to all the students she taught. She watched many of them grow up and move away to colleges and new lives. Some of them went on to become music teachers themselves. Robert always supported Margaret's music. He built her a special room in their house where she could practice without bothering the neighbors. He bought her a beautiful baby grand piano for their 10th wedding anniversary. Even though he could not read music himself, he loved to sit and listen to her play in the evenings. As Margaret got older, her fingers started to hurt sometimes. The doctor said she had arthritis, which made her joints stiff and sore. She worried that she would not be able to play anymore, but Robert encouraged her to keep practicing. "Your music is too beautiful to stop," he would say. Margaret learned to manage the pain in her hands. She did special exercises to keep her fingers flexible. She played every day, even if it was just for a few minutes. The music was too much a part of her to give up. When Robert got sick 3 years ago, Margaret spent most of her time taking care of him. She played soft music for him when he could not sleep. Even at the end, when he was very weak, he would smile when he heard her playing their favorite songs. After Robert died, Margaret felt lost for the first time in many years. The house was too quiet without him. She tried to keep teaching piano lessons, but her heart was not in it anymore. Finally, she decided to sell the house and move to Golden Years Retirement Community. The retirement home was nice enough. Margaret had a small apartment with room for her electronic keyboard. But it was not the same as having her own piano. The other residents were friendly, but most of them did not know much about music. They saw her as just another elderly woman whose best days were behind her. Margaret looked around the community center where she was sitting now. Nobody here knew about the concerts in Vienna or the recordings she had made. They did not know that famous conductors had once called her name from big stages. To Linda and the other volunteers, she was just an old lady who might be able to help with coats. Margaret opened her folder and looked at the sheet music inside. She had kept her favorite pieces all these years. The pages were yellow and some of the corners were torn, but she could still read every note. Her fingers still remembered how to play them, even if the rest of the world had forgotten who she used to be. She looked up at the piano on the stage again. It was not as grand as the piano she used to play, but she could tell it would sound good. She wondered what it would feel like to perform for people again. Not for money or fame this time, but just to share the music that still lived inside her. Frank was talking to her, but Margaret had not been listening. "I'm sorry," she said. "What did you say?" "I asked if you were feeling all right," Frank said with concern. "You looked sad there for a minute." Margaret smiled at him. "I'm fine. Just remembering some old times." "Good memories, I hope," Frank said. "Very good memories?" Margaret replied. She closed her folder and settled back in her chair. Tonight would just be about checking coats. But the music was still there, waiting inside her fingers, ready to wake up if she ever got the chance. The evening of the charity event finally arrived. Margaret had gone home to her small apartment to rest and change clothes. She put on her nicest black dress and a string of pearls that Robert had given her for their 20th anniversary. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw an old woman, but she still felt like the young pianist who had once performed for thousands of people. Margaret arrived at the community center at 6 o'clock. The place looked completely different from that morning. Soft lights made everything glow warmly. The tables were covered with white cloths and had beautiful flower arrangements in the center. People were already arriving, dressed in their best clothes. The men wore suits and ties, and the women had on pretty dresses and jewelry. Frank was already at the coat check table, looking nervous in his best shirt and tie. "You look very nice, Margaret," he said, when she sat down next to him. "This is fancier than I expected," Margaret agreed. The event looked more elegant than most of the concerts she had performed at years ago. Linda had done a good job making everything look perfect. Guests were arriving steadily, and Margaret and Frank stayed busy hanging up coats and giving out acclaim tickets. As Margaret worked, she listened to the conversations around her. People were talking about the children's hospital and how much money they hoped to raise tonight. Some of them were doctors and nurses who worked at the hospital. Others were business people from town who wanted to help sick children. Everyone seemed excited about the evening. Linda walked past the coat check table several times. Each time she looked more worried. Margaret noticed that Linda kept checking her phone and looking toward the stage where the piano sat silent. At 7:30, Linda came over to Margaret and Frank. "Have either of you seen a young woman with red hair?" Linda asked. "She's wearing a green dress and carrying a music bag. She was supposed to be here an hour ago." Margaret and Frank both shook their heads. "Is that the piano player?" Frank asked. Linda nodded, looking very stressed. "Her name is Jessica Mills. She's a music student from the college. I hired her 2 days ago after my first pianist canceled." Linda looked at her phone again. "She's not answering my calls." At 8 o'clock, the guests were supposed to sit down for dinner. The plan was for soft piano music to play while people ate. But Jessica Mills was still nowhere to be found. Linda was making phone call after phone call, trying to reach her. Margaret watched Linda pace back and forth near the stage. The dinner was starting, but there was no music. The room felt strangely quiet without it. People were talking and laughing, but something was missing. The evening that was supposed to be perfect was not going according to plan. At 8:15, Linda's phone finally rang. Margaret could hear Linda's voice getting louder as she talked. When Linda hung up, she looked like she might cry. She walked quickly over to the coat check table. "That was Jessica," Linda said. "She's not coming. She got food poisoning and is too sick to play." Linda looked around the room desperately. "I don't know what to do. I've called everyone I can think of. No other piano players are available tonight." Margaret felt her heart start to beat faster. This was the moment she had been waiting for, even though she had not known it. "Linda," she said quietly, "I told you this morning that I could play piano." Linda looked at Margaret with the same doubtful expression she had worn that morning. "I know you offered, but this is really important. We have over 200 people here tonight. They're expecting professional music." "I am professional," Margaret said simply. She stood up and picked up her folder of sheet music. "I've been playing piano for 60 years. I can play the music you need." Linda looked around the room. She could see that people were starting to notice the lack of music. Some guests were looking toward the stage and whispering to each other. Linda was running out of options. "Are you sure you can handle this?" Linda asked. "You'll need to play for almost 2 hours. The music has to be background music that doesn't interfere with conversation, but it also has to be good enough that people enjoy listening." Margaret smiled. "I understand exactly what you need. I've played at many dinner events like this." Frank nodded encouragingly. "Margaret knows a lot about music," he said. "You should let her try." Linda looked at her watch. It was almost 8:30. The dinner service was starting whether there was music or not. She had to make a decision. "Okay," she said finally. "But if it doesn't work out, you'll need to stop playing. I can't have anything go wrong tonight." Margaret felt a familiar excitement building inside her. It was the same feeling she used to get before walking onto a concert stage. Her hands were steady and her mind was clear. She had been waiting for this moment for 3 years, ever since Robert died and she stopped teaching piano lessons. She walked slowly toward the stage, carrying her folder of music. People at the nearby tables noticed her moving toward the piano. Some of them looked curious. Others went back to their conversations, not paying much attention to the elderly woman in the black dress. Margaret climbed the 3 steps to the stage, carefully. The piano bench was the right height, and she adjusted it slightly. She opened her folder and spread out several pieces of sheet music on the piano's music stand. She chose songs that would be perfect for a dinner event, not too loud or dramatic, but beautiful enough to enhance the evening. Linda stood at the bottom of the stage steps, watching nervously. She had her phone ready in case she needed to call someone else to fix the situation. Margaret could feel Linda's doubt, but she did not let it bother her. She had learned long ago not to let other people's expectations affect her music. Margaret placed her fingers on the piano keys for the first time in months. The keys felt familiar under her fingertips, like greeting an old friend. She tested a few chords quietly to get used to the piano's sound and touch. It was a decent instrument, better than she had expected. She took a deep breath and chose her opening piece. It would be Debussy's Clair de Lune, a gentle and beautiful song that most people would recognize. It was perfect for the beginning of dinner, soft enough to let people talk, but lovely enough to set a romantic mood. Margaret began to play. The first notes floated across the room like a gentle breeze. Her fingers found their rhythm immediately, as if she had never stopped performing. The arthritis in her hand seemed to disappear as the music took over. At first, only a few people noticed the music starting. But as Margaret continued to play, more and more heads turned toward the stage. The melody of Clair de Lune was so beautiful and perfectly played that it was impossible to ignore. Linda stood watching with her mouth slightly open. This was not what she had expected from the elderly woman who had offered to help that morning. This was real, professional music. Linda began to relax for the first time all evening. Margaret finished Clair de Lune and moved smoothly into her next piece without stopping. She had planned a whole evening of music that would flow from one song to another. She could see people at the tables beginning to smile as they recognized familiar melodies. For the first time in 3 years, Margaret felt completely herself again. She was not just an old lady living in a retirement home. She was a musician sharing her gift with people who needed to hear beautiful music. The years of silence were over. Margaret's fingers moved across the piano keys like they had a life of their own. After playing several gentle pieces during dinner, she decided it was time to show what she could really do. The main course had been served and people were relaxed and happy. This was the perfect moment for something special. She looked through her sheet music and found the piece she was looking for. It was Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor, one of the most difficult and beautiful pieces ever written for piano. Oh, was the same piece she had played at her very first major concert in Vienna so many years ago. Her fingers still remembered every note. Margaret placed the sheet music on the piano stand, though she did not really need it. This piece was written in her heart and hands. She took a deep breath and positioned her fingers over the keys. The room was still filled with the quiet sounds of dinner conversation, clinking glasses, and gentle laughter. Then Margaret began to play, and everything changed. The opening notes of the ballade were soft and mysterious, like a question being asked in the darkness. Margaret's left hand played a simple melody while her right hand added delicate decorations. The music seemed to float through the room, catching people's attention without demanding it. But this was just the beginning. Margaret knew that this piece would grow and change, becoming more powerful and complex as it went on. She had chosen it specifically because it would wake people up and make them really listen. As the music developed, Margaret's fingers began to move faster. The simple melody became more complicated, with both hands playing difficult patterns at the same time. The ballad told a story through music, and Margaret was the storyteller. Her face showed the emotions of the piece, sometimes peaceful, sometimes dramatic, always deeply felt. People at the tables closest to the stage stopped talking first. They put down their forks and turned to watch the elderly woman who was playing. Such incredible music. The melody was familiar to some of them, but they had never heard it played with such skill and passion. The music grew louder and more intense. Margaret's fingers flew across the keys, playing runs and scales that most pianists spent years learning to master. Her hands moved independently, each one playing a different rhythm, but together they created perfect harmony. The arthritis that usually made her joints ache seemed to disappear completely. More people stopped their conversations to listen. The sound of clinking glasses and quiet chatter began to fade as Margaret's music filled the room. She was completely lost in the piece. Now her eyes closed, her body swaying slightly with the rhythm. She looked like she was having a conversation with the piano, and the piano was answering back. Linda stood at the side of the room, staring at the stage in amazement. This was not background dinner music anymore. This was a concert-level performance happening in their community center. She could not believe that she had almost sent this woman to work at the coat check table. The ballade reached its most difficult section, where both hands had to play incredibly fast and precise notes at the same time. This part of the piece was so hard that even professional pianists sometimes made mistakes. But Margaret's fingers never hesitated. Every note was perfect, every rhythm exact. She played like someone who had been doing this her whole life. Frank had left the coat check table and moved closer to the stage. He stood with his mouth open, watching Margaret's hands move like magic across the keys. He had never heard anything like this in person before. He understood now why Margaret had seemed sad earlier when Linda had dismissed her offer to play. The music built to a powerful climax that filled every corner of the room. Margaret's whole body was involved in the performance now. Her shoulders moved with the melody, her feet worked the piano pedals to create different sounds, and her face showed every emotion the music contained. She was not just playing the piece, she was living it. Dr. Sarah Chen, one of the doctors from the children's hospital, stopped eating completely and turned her chair to face the stage. She knew classical music well and recognized what she was, hearing. This was world-class piano playing. She whispered to her husband, "That woman is incredible. I've heard this piece performed by famous pianists, and she's as good as any of them." The conversation in the room became quieter and quieter as more people noticed the extraordinary music coming from the stage. Even people who did not usually like classical music found themselves drawn in by Margaret's performance. The piece was so beautifully played that it spoke to everyone, no matter what kind of music they usually enjoyed. Margaret moved into the final section of the ballade where the melody became both triumphant and sad at the same time. Her touch on the keys was incredibly gentle for such a complex piece. Each note rang out clearly, and the emotions in the music seemed to reach directly into people's hearts. Some of the women in the audience had tears in their eyes. The music was so beautiful and so perfectly played that it moved them deeply. They had come to the charity dinner expecting a nice evening with good food and maybe some pleasant background music. Instead, they were witnessing something truly special. Margaret's years of experience showed in every phrase she played. She knew exactly when to make the music louder and when to make it softer. She knew how to make certain notes stand out and how to blend others together. Most importantly, she knew how to make the music tell its story in a way that touched people's souls. The young waiters who were serving dinner stopped what they were doing to listen. They stood along the walls of the room, holding their trays, completely caught up in Margaret's performance. One of them, a college student named Marcus, had never heard classical music played live before. He found himself holding his breath, afraid that any sound might disturb the magic happening on stage. As the ballade neared its end, Margaret opened her eyes and looked out at her audience. She could see that she had their complete attention, now. The room was almost silent, except for her music. People were leaning forward in their chairs, not wanting to miss a single note. Margaret smiled slightly as she played the final phrases of the piece. Her fingers moved with perfect control through the last difficult passages. She had not lost her touch after all these years. If anything, the life experience she had gained since her concert days had made her playing even more expressive and meaningful. The last notes of the ballad rang out in the completely silent room. Margaret held her hands above the keys for a moment, letting the sound fade away naturally. Then she placed her hands gently in her lap and looked out at the audience. For several seconds, nobody moved. The silence was so complete that Margaret could hear her own heartbeat. Then, like a dam bursting, the entire room erupted in applause. The applause started like thunder and grew even louder. Every person in the room was clapping as hard as they could. People jumped to their feet so quickly that chairs scraped against the floor. The standing ovation went on, showing no signs of stopping. Margaret sat at the piano bench, looking out at the crowd in surprise. She had not expected this kind of reaction. These people had come for a charity dinner, not a piano concert. But they were applauding like she had just given the performance of a lifetime. Linda was clapping harder than anyone else. She had tears running down her cheeks as she thought about how wrong she had been that morning. She had almost missed having this incredible music at her event because she had judged Margaret by her age instead of her abilities. Linda felt ashamed of herself, but also amazed by what she had just witnessed. Dr. Chen turned to the people at her table and said loudly over the applause, "That was extraordinary. I've been to concerts at Carnegie Hall that weren't as moving as what we just heard." The other doctors nodded in agreement, still clapping enthusiastically. Frank had moved as close to the stage as he could get. He was clapping and smiling so widely that his face hurt. He felt proud to know Margaret, even though he had only met her that morning. He also felt sad that she had been hiding such incredible talent from the world. The applause continued for almost 3 full minutes. Margaret finally stood up from the piano bench and gave a small bow to acknowledge the audience. This made them clap even harder. Someone in the back of the room shouted, "More! Please play more!" Margaret looked down at Linda, who was nodding enthusiastically. "Please," Linda called up to her, "play whatever you want. This is the most beautiful music we've ever had at one of our events." Margaret smiled and sat back down at the piano. She decided to play something completely different, a cheerful jazz version of "The Way You Look Tonight." Her fingers danced across the keys in a completely different style, showing that she could play any kind of music beautifully. People began to sway in their seats as the jazz melody filled the room. Some couples even started dancing between the tables. The mood had changed from formal and quiet to joyful and celebratory. Margaret's music had transformed the entire atmosphere of the evening. As she played the jazz piece, Margaret felt more alive than she had in years. This was what she had been missing since Robert died, the chance to share her music with people who appreciated it. She had forgotten how good it felt to see faces light up when they heard her play. When she finished the jazz song, the audience applauded again, though not quite as loudly as before. They were getting used to being amazed by this remarkable woman. Margaret looked through her sheet music and found a beautiful ballad that people could sing along with if they wanted to. She began playing "The Way We Were," and soon people throughout the room were humming along. Margaret played it slowly and gently, making it easy for people to join in with the melody. Some of the older couples in the audience held hands as they listened to the romantic song. After that, Margaret took requests from the audience. People called out the names of their favorite songs, and Margaret seemed to know every one of them. She played "Yesterday" by the Beatles, "Fly Me to the Moon," "What a Wonderful World," and many others. Each song was arranged in her own special style, making familiar music sound fresh and new, A little girl at one of the tables called out, "Do you know Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star?" Margaret smiled and played a beautiful, complex version of the simple children's song that made it sound like a classical masterpiece. The little girl clapped her hands in delight. Margaret played for almost an hour, taking the audience on a journey through different types of music. She played classical pieces, popular songs, jazz standards, and even some Broadway show tunes. Her fingers never seemed to get tired, and her memory for music seemed endless. Between songs, people came up to the stage to talk to her. They thanked her for the beautiful music and asked questions about her background. Margaret was modest about her past, saying only that she had played piano for many years and had enjoyed music her whole life. But Dr. Chen was persistent. "I know professional music when I hear it," she said to Margaret during a brief break. "You've had serious training. Where did you study? Who was your teacher?" Margaret smiled mysteriously. "I studied in Europe many years ago, but that was a long time ago, when I was very young." Linda came up to the stage with her clipboard, but this time she looked embarrassed instead of bossy. "Margaret, I owe you a huge apology. I was completely wrong about you this morning. You've made this evening more special than I ever imagined it could be." "There's no need to apologize," Margaret said kindly. "People make assumptions. It happens to everyone." "But I should have listened to you," Linda insisted. "I almost ruined the evening because I judged you by your appearance instead of giving you a chance." Margaret patted Linda's hand. "The important thing is that everything worked out well. Your event is a success, and money will be raised for the children's hospital. That's what really matters." As the evening wound down, Margaret played several gentle songs to help people relax after dinner. The auction part of the event was starting, but people kept asking her to play one more song. She was happy to keep playing as long as people wanted to listen. During the auction, Margaret played softly in the background, but even her quiet playing was so beautiful that sometimes people stopped bidding just to listen to her music. The auctioneer joked that he was having trouble competing with the pianist for people's attention. When the formal program finally ended around 10 o'clock, Margaret played one last song. She chose "Amazing Grace," which seemed perfect for ending such a special evening. Her version was simple and spiritual, bringing a peaceful feeling to the room after all the excitement. The final applause was long and heartfelt. People stood up again, but this time they were also saying goodbye. Many of them came up to Margaret personally to thank her and shake her hand. Several people asked if she gave piano lessons or performed at other events. As Margaret packed up her sheet music, she felt different than she had that morning. She was still the same 78-year-old woman, but now people saw her differently. They saw her for who she really was, a talented musician who still had much to offer the world. Frank helped her down from the stage and walked with her to collect her coat. "That was the most amazing thing I've ever seen," he told her. "You're famous now. Everyone in town is going to be talking about this evening." Margaret laughed. "I don't need to be famous. I just needed to play music for people who wanted to hear it. That's enough for me." But as Margaret walked out of the community center that night, she knew that her life had changed. She would never again be seen as just another elderly resident of Golden Years Retirement Community. She was Margaret Henderson, the pianist who had reminded an entire room of people that age is just a number, and that real talent never gets old. The evening had raised more money for the Children's Hospital than any previous charity event, but that wasn't the only thing it had accomplished. It had also reminded everyone there that they should never judge people by how they look or how old they are. Sometimes the most extraordinary gifts come in the most unexpected packages. Margaret went to bed that night with her fingers still tingling from playing and her heart full of joy. Tomorrow, she would start getting phone calls from people who wanted to hire her for their own events. Her performing days were not over after all. They were just beginning again.